Well, to Canadians, wilderness is really part of the national narrative about their history. They conquer the wilderness. Mm-hmm. They expand into it and conquer it. And that's how Canada becomes great. Mm-hmm. To Native people, to Indigenous people, there is no concept of wilderness. Mm-hmm. They live in their communities, whichever they are, whether it's a small band mm-hmm. with teepees or a community. Mm-hmm. And the land that surrounds them is not wilderness. It's their pantry. It's their backyard. Mm-hmm. They know that land. Yeah. Whether it has trees on it or grassland, it is not a wilderness to them, and it never has been. It is a cultural landscape.
Yeah.
Canadians' idea of wilderness is fiction.
Hey folks, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. I'm Matthew Christoph. On this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. The podcast is a forum for people to have conversations that, will maybe make you think differently about stuff. I'm bringing on people, researchers and professionals to talk about interesting things about landscape management, conservation, forestry, that kind of stuff. And yeah, it's just meant to turn your crank and get you thinking differently. So it doesn't necessarily represent the opinions of the sponsors. It's just cool information and interesting conversation. So today's episode, I'm really excited about. I'm excited about all the episodes, but this one was good too. So today's episode is with Dr. Patricia McCormack, and she is a professor emeritus of Native Studies from the University of Alberta. And she recently has been doing a lot of research into looking into Indigenous management in northern Alberta, BC, Northwest Territories kind of area. So it's up in the northern, what was at one point the northern parkland or northern grasslands. And she's found evidence to point that a lot of the northern area, like around Wood Buffalo National Park, which is a massive area in Alberta, was mostly grass up until the early 1900s. And her research shows that majority of it is from a lack of Indigenous burning. So the Indigenous people used to go burning through there for all kinds of reasons, for hunting purposes, for basket weaving purposes, for berries, for all kinds of different stuff. And one of the reasons that trees didn't develop until recently was because there was always fires. So anyways, I wanted to talk to her about that because she had pictures and proof and all kinds of interesting stuff. And so I wanted to talk to her about how she knows the landscape has been drastically altered because of a lack of burning. So I thought that was really interesting. So it was a great conversation. She's very passionate about her work. She really does her research and makes sure she knows what she's talking about. I loved having a conversation with her. It was great. Other kind of things that we talked about was the role of bison up in that area and the role of bison in Indigenous people's lives. And what we can learn from this new information that we're learning, right? How we can adapt our current strategies to account for these findings. How can we change management? How can we change conservation? How can we change Indigenous relations and that kind of stuff and promote Indigenous health as well as environmental health and better management overall. So yeah, it was a great conversation. You guys are really going to like it. Sponsors, same three as always. The number one sponsor that I could not do this without, I can't say that enough, is West Fraser. West Fraser has been a sponsor for the last 2 years. And they're doing awesome work in the forest industry to do exactly the type of stuff that we're trying to figure out here, right? How to be sustainable and do the right thing. And they're doing just that. And the secondary sponsor, Greenlink Forestry, been with me since the beginning, and I couldn't do this without them either. And finally, Damage Timber. Damage Timber is a company here in Edmonton. They are doing mostly apparel, but they're actually getting into doing some more woodworking stuff. So they're doing some pretty cool stuff with wood from burns, from wildfire. So he's going in and actually collecting wood from wildfire areas and turning that into like cutting boards and butcher blocks and charcuterie boards and that kind of stuff. It is super, super cool. Definitely check out damagetimber.com. put in your Forest 10 at checkout. You can get 10% off. Yeah, he does custom boards. There's all kinds of stuff. I was just getting into it, so he may be a little behind in getting your orders done, but it's so cool. Definitely check it out. Yeah. Without further messing around, let's jump right into it. Talking with Patricia McCormack, Dr. Patricia McCormack, about the ethno-history of Northern Alberta and Indigenous burning and bison. Here we go. Oh, one more thing. I apologize for all the bangs and clicks that you might hear throughout this episode. I've been trying to figure out what the heck it is for a long time. Long-time listeners probably heard it before on the podcast. And it's my mic stands, and I don't know how to fix them, but I'm working on it. So I apologize, but it's a great episode. I hope you guys like it. First of all, I guess we'll just explain. So we're here to talk about your work around the ethno-history of the northern forests of, would you say Alberta? Or
I would say even broader. Northern forests of going also into adjacent Northeast BC, into the Northwest Territories.
Okay, perfect. And that would, so meaning we're going to talk about the effects of Indigenous people and their management of that area pre-colonization and how that has changed over time and what,
right,
and that kind of stuff. So before we get into all that, I just want to get to know you a little bit and how you got into this. So how did you get into, you're a professor, how do you say that, emeritus?
Yes, Professor Emerita, which means basically I'm retired.
Oh, you're retired. That's what it means. Okay.
It means that I retired. I became a full professor, and then I retired from the Faculty of Native Studies,
Gotcha.
Although I'm actually trained as an anthropologist.
Oh, I see. Okay. All over
and
the map.
an ethnohistorian.
That's awesome. You got all kinds of stuff pulling.
You bet.
It all works together, right?
It all does absolutely work together.
That's awesome. Cool. So, and that was all at the University of Alberta.
I did my studies at the U, and that's where I was on faculty as well.
Okay. Awesome. So what brought you to, or what brought the attention to your attention, the idea of, Indigenous people and the land management that they did contact with colonials?
Well, and not just pre-contact, up to the early 20th century.
Right.
I did my doctoral research in Fort Chipewyan, which is right on the edge of Wood Buffalo National Park.
Yep.
And one of the people in the department at that time and ended up on my supervisory committee was Dr. Hank Lewis.
Okay.
Who did pioneering research on controlled burning by Denetah people, Indigenous people in Northwest Alberta. Mm-hmm. So we were all very keen on learning more about controlled burning and across Northern Alberta. And I looked at it in Wood Buffalo Park.
Okay.
As part of my dissertation research.
Awesome. That's cool. That's and you've just kept with it all this time, right? Like,
well, and I've actually come back to it because I'm working with the burning, I'm working with northern bison, and I'm working with concepts of culture area, and they all converge.
Oh, okay. It's just a fascinating. Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. What year was this? This was in the 70s or something, or
my dissertation. I completed my dissertation in 1984, but I was doing then my honors thesis was about Fort Chipewyan, and its colonial history. My master's was a thesis actually about choices that people could make who were Chipewyan in terms of the way they organized their annual cycles. And then I came back to relook at Fort Chipewyan and try to understand its history. Oh,
okay. Interesting. So, because this idea for me of Indigenous, like, management of the landscape via fire and other means is a new idea. And it's not an idea that I was familiar with when I was going to school. Was it something that was in academia, at least, and obviously the Indigenous people have known about it, right?
Yes.
But in academia, at least, is it something that was pretty new back then when you were starting?
Well, certainly at the University of Alberta, it was Hank Lewis that really pioneered it. And then he also worked with people involved with forestry at the university. But it's not a new idea. There's been lots of work done on it, lots of work published on it for other parts of North America.
Okay.
So, for instance, people would talk about the so-called virgin forests of the Northeast.
Yes.
Well, they weren't.
Right.
Probably most of those forests grew up after the early diseases came in and depopulated that area.
Right.
And there weren't people around to continue doing land management.
Yeah. It is interesting, right? Like my entire childhood, I remember thinking about, like, you have this whole idea of the virgin forest and the vast wilderness and an untouched wilderness. People weren't there, and then slowly with time you start to recognize, like, okay, well, indigenous people have been here for whatever since 13,000 years.
Oh, farther back than that,
or more,
depending.
right?
Yeah, much more, probably 25,000 or longer. And I think that certainly in the north, I think people probably started to burn when the forest started to move in after the glaciers left.
Right.
Because it's hard to cope with forests. Forests are not places where, which are good for hunters and gatherers. Mm-hmm. It has a very small animal biomass. Mm-hmm. I mean, animals do use the forest, but animals mostly use edges. Sure. They may go into the forest for shelter. Caribou do that, for instance, but caribou don't eat spruce. Yeah. They eat the lichens that may grow in that area.
Sure.
And they may shelter in the forest if there's a lot of wind, but they're not basically forest dwellers.
Right. And it's just difficult moving through there, right? Difficult to hunt there than compared to the plains.
Even if you have forests, and I don't know how many people have ever tried to bushwhack through a thick forest. It's really hard.
Yeah.
And it's even harder after the forest has been burned and you get windfall. Mm-hmm. I lived for a few years in a little town in the Yukon called Faro.
Oh, yeah.
Which had been burned. Mm-hmm. And I used to do my dog walks. I found a route through, they rebuilt the town after the forest fire. And then I redid I did my dog walks every day, making a route through the windfall.
Oh, yeah.
And it was dirty and messy. But if I was going to walk, there was nothing else I could do.
Except that ash gets everywhere, right?
Oh, my goodness. Charcoal. It was awful. Yeah.
Yeah, you get it on something. You're not getting it off.
No, it doesn't come off.
Yeah.
And the only good thing, I remember talking to an older man who had dogs down by the Pelly River. And I said to him, that forest fire must have been awful. And, he told me though, and he said, now you can see things. Mm. Now you can see to hunt. Mm. So he wasn't talking about the windfall areas where you couldn't really see much of anything, but other areas that had been cleared out because of the forest. That was a light went on when I heard that comment from him.
Yeah. It's important that the forest has, it's not a homogeneous place. It needs to have a mosaic of landscape. Has different ages, different everything, right? And I think that's something that we've known for a long time, but I think as far as common knowledge for a lot of people, especially in forestry and that kind of stuff, I don't think it was understood that the land had been managed by people for as long as it has. I think most people assume that it's been managed by settlers for the last 150 years, 200 years or something like that. I don't think most people recognize, and you say as much in your paper, right, that it's not recognized that the indigenous people actually did this. And it's
most white people didn't think Indians were smart enough.
Of course.
There was a profound racism directed at Native people. They thought Native people just set wildfires willy-nilly.
Yeah.
And that they had to basically stop them from behaving in that way.
Yeah.
People like Dr. Hugh Raup, who did work on vegetation in Wood Buffalo Park, believed, even when he was quite elderly, and all of this literature about controlled burning was in the press, right?
Yeah.
That he didn't believe that Native people were smart enough to do that, which was a kind of racialization of their indigenous knowledge.
Yeah. I mean, we're all people, I guess. We all have our gaps.
Well, he comes out of an earlier era.
Right.
So he was a man of his time, and he probably associated mostly, because he didn't speak any of the native languages.
Yeah.
And he would have associated mostly with the white managers of the park.
Oh, absolutely. Of course,
who also had a certain amount of disdain for native people.
Right. So I want to get into the idea of indigenous people managing the landscape and kind of, So I did a whole series, I was telling with Amy Cardinal Christensen on indigenous cultural burning, right? We were talking to people from around the globe about it, and it was interesting, super enlightening for me, learned a lot about it, but it was mostly about currently. What's going on, what happened when they stopped burning, what's happening now, how can we get it back on? I want to go back and talk a little bit about, because you pointed to the things that really got my attention during your talk at the Indigenous Consultation Conference at CIF, was you were showing proof of how the landscape changed when cultural burning was not allowed to take place, and the paradigm of fire suppression took over, and everything else, right? Like we know the story. How do we start to set the scene, to explain, to paint a picture for people listening about what the landscape, or what we think the landscape looked like, let's say at the turn of the 20th century, or just before that, before fires were suppressed so heavily?
Well, I think the key thing to remember is that Native people didn't just wander around the landscape. Mm-hmm. They had very specific annual cycles of movement and resource exploitation. The animals and the plants, they hunted and they gathered. Mm-hmm. And so to make sure that they could always find those animals and plants, they managed the land so that those animals and plants were most likely to be where they expected them to be mm-hmm. at certain times of the year.
Right.
The only way in the north that you can do that is by using a measure of very carefully controlled burning.
Right.
Because if you burn, then what you are doing is you're creating grasslands. In other words, you're creating vegetation regimes that are in early succession stages.
Right.
And you're also then creating the edges between those grasslands and the forests, which are highly productive habitats for animals.
Yeah.
And your burning patterns in doing that also provide a whole lot of benefits, of course.
So much, yeah.
But the benefit that I think that I've really been focusing on in recent years was not just the management for the animals and vegetation, but the management to prevent Holocaust fires.
Right.
Which are terribly tragic. They burn up animals, they burn up people. Mm-hmm. And
So what do you mean by Holocaust fires, just to be clear?
By a Holocaust fire, I mean,
it's the first time I've heard that term used is by you.
Oh, so. I've heard it. I'm not sure where I heard it. I've heard it lots, but I think of it as one of the disastrous crowning fires, the kind of fire that burned up Slave Lake, that burned up Fort McMurray,
sure.
That's been burning in Australia.
Mm-hmm. The unprecedented massive fire.
A very massive fire.
Yeah.
One that is very difficult to impossible to get under control. Mm-hmm. And those fires are now being described as the new normal, mm-hmm. which is rather scary.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, through climate scientists and that kind of stuff, and it's become evident that those fires, they have become a new normal. It seems like because of the increased in fuel load and the homogeneity of the landscape, and really, so there's just a constant fuel load for fires to go through.
But that kind of landscape that is the result of those fires is not nearly as productive a landscape for indigenous hunters and gatherers mm-hmm. as a landscape that is managed
sure.
in a regular way. They risk fires. Mm-hmm. The animals that they're hunting and rely upon mm-hmm. Burn up.
Yep. Sure.
The pattern of succession after a fire when you have fire suppression is that you may get areas that are good for moose for a couple of years, but then they disappear mm-hmm. because they grow up. Mm-hmm. So it's not as reliable an inventory of resources as you would have had if you did regular controlled burning in very specific ways.
Yeah. Yeah. The management style, when it went from being indigenous managers, I say managing as if it's like they were doing it for, you know what I mean? Like an industry, but they were managing because that
is management.
They were coexisting, right?
They were doing it. They were setting out to burn certain areas, probably not mm-hmm. every year, but every so often, and doing apparently a very good job of it when you see the extent of areas that were maintained as grasslands or parkland.
Yeah.
Enormous swaths of land in northern Alberta mm-hmm. into northern northeast BC and also into the southern Northwest Territories.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess what I meant was more that they were managing for their lifestyle. They were managing for multiple values. They were managing for,
right.
And I feel like nowadays we try to emulate that in some extent. We're managing for multiple values, sure. But I think we're still missing some of those values. We're still sorting out how to balance these values.
I think the primary value we're managing forests for now are economic values for lumber cutting.
Yeah, as far as the vegetation is concerned,
that's the primary value. I don't see those forests being managed to maximize, for instance, the animals.
Sure.
That would be part of a natural, healthy forest.
Yeah, and I think that might be a result of, and I don't know this is just my anecdotal thought, but I think it's a result of us thinking that up until very recently that this is the way the forest always was.
Yes.
Right? And so I don't think it's intentional. I think it's that we're like, hey, this is the forest we have. Let's keep it like this. Yeah. Right? And so now we're starting to recognize, and I say we, I mean the broader culture is starting to recognize that, oh, maybe it's not supposed to be like this. Or maybe, you know what I mean? 100 years ago, it was vastly different.
Well, ironically, the fires that have resulted from these fire suppression programs have destroyed timber that logging companies rely upon.
Big time.
There are forestry companies that say they can't cut the logs the amount of wood that they are required to cut by their licenses because the forest fires have burned them down. Yeah,
there's a lot of concern. Like the forest company is I know they're working diligently to try. They're all about sustainability, right? They know that if this is not sustainable, that they can't continue to operate ethically, right? And so they wouldn't. So they know that they have to work to make sure that this is true, right? And it's something that I think it's challenging. You're right, because these large fires, almost every mill I think that exists today has experienced some massive fire that's taken out a large portion of their forest management area, right. And they're probably looking at their timber yields and seeing a big gap somewhere in there, right? And they're trying to figure out how to do that. And so it's interesting that there's so many ironic things going on that it's fascinating, right? It's really, really, it's interesting. Anyways.
Well, if they're looking particularly at harvesting conifers, then they're looking at decades before they'll be able to harvest again after a major forest fire. And these are trees that they have counted on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and there's some interesting thought there. Like I've had a few people on talking about silviculture, you know what I mean, how we grow back the forest and all that kind of stuff, and we're really, really good at it, right? For every tree they cut down, they're making sure there's a bunch more on the ground, right? Like they want to make sure that they're doing sustainable harvesting and all that. But there's been some talk that maybe the system needs to change a little, and I have no idea if this is true or not. It's just these are just thoughts, right? And that there might be maybe we need to increase deciduous harvest and decrease conifer harvest, and I don't know. These are just thoughts.
Depends on what products they want to take to market. That's
and really technology is getting better too, right? Like they can derive so much from just raw cellulose and lignin that it's fascinating, right? But anyways, we're getting sidetracked here. We're talking about indigenous management of the forest.
But at the same time, the forestry process, and I was actually quite shocked to learn last fall that this is something I had not known, that Roundup, for instance, was being aerial sprayed by logging companies, which mean to basically prevent or suppress what they see as weed tree species.
But it's mostly for grass. The aspen is more. It's sometimes you're right. It absolutely is used to reduce aspen.
But I see that as damaging the integrity of a forest.
It's changing.
And the animals that will then live there, the berry plants that would be living there. And I think the thing that goes along with that is that all of these areas in the north, especially in northern Alberta and into northern BC, those are all areas where indigenous people are still using the land.
Yep.
For hunting and fishing and gathering. Yep. And so they need forests that still will produce the plants and animals that they are seeking as part of their way of life.
Yeah. No, and I agree, and I see, and this is where my thoughts on this subject are torn, because I've spoken with toxicologists, and I've spoken with ecologists, and I've spoken with silviculturists, and I've spoken with indigenous people all about this issue, right? And a lot of that happened on recording, and it's come to my attention that, I mean, the herbicide that's being applied from a toxicologist perspective is not, it's harmful in that it kills out the aspen, kills out the grass temporarily for 10 or 15 years until it can establish itself again, right? But it's not a poison on the landscape. It's not it's not staying in the soil or going into the water.
I use Roundup for thistle in my yard. So totally. I'm familiar with it, and I know that it's considered to be actually safe.
Sure.
But what I'm concerned about how it changes the composition of the forest that results after logging.
And that's what I was about to say. Yeah. That's the next thing. The argument is that is that like logging companies do it now, because they're following the policy that we put in place that says, if you cut down a spruce forest, you need to have a spruce forest come back. And we know now that that's not how the forest succeeds itself, right? But that they're kind of beholden to the situation of the time, right? And I had a whole podcast on that as well, on the changing to become more of a successional forest rotation. But anyways, the idea is that it's a controversial subject, and I don't know where I sit in it, and that I see that there's a reduction in definitely like berry plants and that kind of stuff. So when it comes to those small forbs and that kind of stuff, that is a problem as far as berry picking or whatever. And then there's also the policy. So the forest companies are forced to make sure they have this come back. So the policy needs to change. And then, but also there's so many angles to it that I'm torn at the idea. I think I foresee most companies, I think, are moving away from it because of social pressure, and they're recognizing that, like, hey, we can do this differently. We know it's not a problem, but people see it as a problem. Let's just try to steer clear. We don't want this on our hands. We don't want to be the bad guys, right? Because they're not. They're the people that love the forest as much as you and I do, right? And they want to see it sustainable. So anyways.
So I think of the things such as the berry plants. Yeah. And a lot of people think of those as inconsequential, but if you're living a traditional way of life, or living at least part of your life is a traditional way of life, you need those berry plants. They're incredibly important.
Medicine plants too.
And medicine plants. Yeah. Medicines in the forest, in the areas where forests are important. It's a very sensitive topic. It's not something talked about easily by people in the communities.
Oh, there's a lot of militant people on both sides, right?
Yeah.
And then you got to try to be more centrist, try to be more reasonable. What's the real thing here, right? And that's why I appreciate people like yourself who have an open mind to this kind of stuff and recognize that it's not I always like to say the evil corporation trying to, you know what I mean? These are people trying to do the right thing, and they're doing it for a reason,
also
right?
being dictated to by a government that wants to maximize profits and revenues in certain ways. My gut feeling is probably the timber companies are changing faster than government regulations.
Yeah, I couldn't speak to that. I have no idea.
But I don't, that's speculation.
Of course. Most of this is speculation, I think. But anyways, okay, we should get back on to Indigenous management. So I think, so I want to try to describe the shaping of the landscape by Indigenous people and what that kind of looked like, right? Because today we know we have a lot more forest cover. There's less grasslands and that kind of stuff, right? So how do we know, for example, for sure that like that this is true, that there was more grasslands than there are now, vastly more grasslands, that there was more of a mosaic of a landscape, right? Because I think how do we know that for sure? Well,
we have a lot of different ways we know that. One is the actual research that Dr. Lewis did. For instance, Denetah people would actually tell him what they were doing. He watched them burn. He talked to elders about how burning, what happened as a result of burning, and they would tell him how once you've burned and they would burn normally in very early spring when it was quite safe to do it. Usually, I've seen some of his pictures. There's snow in the background, so
they know what they're doing.
They knew it. Yeah,
these are not people.
This is very empirical.
Absolutely,
it's absolutely empirical.
Yeah.
And then they talk about how the small animals come back, the voles and the mice, which are the food base for the carnivores. How it attracts the moose, brings them in. It helps reduce insect loads. The other downside to the northern forest in the summer is the biting insects. It helps maintain trails. And then also, of course, it reduces the incidence of severe fire and the spread of severe fire. Yeah. So we've got that actual empirical evidence from research.
Oh, that's awesome.
And then his student, Teresa Ferguson, did similar work in the Fort Vermilion area. But we also know from archival or primary sources. So, for instance, if you go into earlier maps of the province, you'll see the amounts of grassland that are shown in the Peace River country. Huge amounts of area. And they're described by people like Alexander Mackenzie. When he went up the Peace River, he talks about the grasslands and the beautiful vistas with a few trees and all these gorgeous prairies all the way up the river. And people would tell him that they went farther along, on either side of the river than he could even see.
Yeah.
The maps are there. The information about these grasslands are there in the primary sources. To my knowledge, no one has, and I may be wrong, I would love to be wrong, but no one has ever mapped the extent of these traditional grasslands, which go all the way into, that's in fact why we got early homesteading in the Peace River country. Homesteaders started to go in 1910.
Okay.
And they went in because they heard it was good for agriculture. Right. And it was good for agriculture because the land was clear.
Yeah.
You had enough trees for building fences and houses, but you didn't actually have to clear the land of trees.
Right.
And they thought that was just natural. They didn't realize they were moving into areas already cleared as a result of long-term native burning.
Yeah. And that was the big, so what really captured my attention right off the bat from your talk was when you were talking about this area in the now Wood Buffalo National Park area. So north of the Peace River. So people go on Google Maps. If you look at the Peace River, you'll see the Peace River. You'll see Wood Buffalo National Park. It's essentially what you described as a giant portion of that park
was grassland.
And today it is
it is forest.
It is forest. It's mixed wood forest and with a lot of wetlands and that kind of stuff. And but from your accounts, it is that from the accounts that you've put together,
right?
It was a lot of that was grassland that was actually being settled. It was all Mesic. It was
huge grassland. If you can envision a map of that part of Alberta, it was probably grassland all the way from the Peace River, all the way to Great Slave Lake.
Yeah.
From that's so south to north, on the east from the Slave River, all the way west to the Caribou Mountains.
It's a massive chunk.
A massive amount of, I've seen the maps. I've got a couple of maps, one drawn by Chief Squirrel, who was a leader of one of the indigenous groups.
Okay.
There's a map that I found in the National Archives, Library and Archives Canada. And then there are the descriptions of people in that area who talk about all the grasslands.
Yep.
Peter Fiddler, who wintered with some Chippewas in the 1790s, talks about going into the Little Buffalo area. And they were hunting buffalo for winter provisions. And he said there was grassland as far as we could see. We couldn't even see any trees. It's an amazing amount.
It is ridiculous
of grassland,
right?
And people, and in the old days in that park, people used to travel through that park with horses because it was so open.
Isn't that crazy to think about? Because you look at that, you can go on Google Maps.
You could not do that today.
No, you go on Google Maps now, and it's all forested. It's all heavily
forested.
It's all
heavily forested, except where it has burned and is recovering from the burn.
Right. Yeah. And so, how do we know, just to play devil's advocate, most of this is me playing devil's advocate.
That's okay.
I believe you, but I want to make sure other people do too. So how do we know that was grassland because of burning and not because of some quote unquote natural forces?
Okay.
Like say, for example, I think an easy one people might point to would be up until the 1880s or whatever, there was a huge herds of bison roaming through there that would have definitely kept down forest cover if they were in there, right? So how do we know that this was because of burning?
In the north, in northern Alberta and northern BC, the buffalo were actually mostly gone by the 1840s.
1840s, okay.
And the buffalo were wiped out in that area to provide pemmican and fresh meat for the fur trade company. Fur trade could not have happened without killing all this buffalo in that area. And we know about the buffalo slaughters on the plains. I think people are less aware of the buffalo slaughters in the north.
Yep.
And that's why we get remnant herds, the remnant herds in Wood Buffalo Park, the Ronald Lake herd just south of the park, and then probably a herd in the Wabasca-Niqua area to the southwest of the park. So yes, the buffalo would have helped with maintaining grasslands. We don't have any sense of the size of those herds. We know that some of the indigenous people relied heavily on the buffalo. There were communal hunts. It sounds very plains-like.
Yeah.
Because they have grasslands. And of course, once those buffalo were wiped out, they became incredibly impoverished. I I know that when Hugh Raup did his work in Wood Buffalo Park, he looked at the soil and he looked at it and he found areas, he said he saw no signs of tree roots anywhere, which suggested to him that
So he was digging soil pits and stuff?
I guess. He said that he thought that there had been no trees for a very long time. There were other people who said these grasslands must have been created by people. And they thought that the people started creating the grasslands when they moved into the area.
Oh, they thought the settlers did it.
No, they thought Indigenous people did it, but they didn't realize that Indigenous people have been in that area ever since deglaciation.
Well,
they didn't realize how long they had been there.
Right.
The Indigenous people moved into that area when there were still proglacial lakes.
Yeah.
So they've been there as long as the land has been fit for habitation.
Of course.
And so, the other thing that leads us to think that grassland was deliberately created. Well, Hugh Raup, for instance, when he looked at this and he said, I don't see any tree roots, he thought it was soil conditions.
That's what I was going to say.
He thought it was the soil conditions that led to these grasslands. But as soon as fire was suppressed, the land started to grow up with shrubs and trees.
Because we know it's all trees now,
right? Because it's all trees. And in fact, very early in the earlier 20th century, people were saying, well, the land is growing up now. These grasslands are now becoming full of shrubs and young trees. So those areas that once were grassland disappeared once fire suppression programs were enforced.
Isn't that fascinating that people can have such an impact on the ecology of a landscape, right? Like it's something that I've been fascinated with lately in the last, ever since I did that Good Fire series with Amy. The idea that there's an argument to be made in my mind. And again, this is just thoughts that I've come up with. I have no proof of this, but I feel like you could argue that the boreal forest is one that evolved with the original inhabitants of this country, right? It evolved because we know that people were here when Beringia was opened up, when the land bridge was opened up, and we know that dissipated, I think it was 15,000 years ago or 13,000 years ago or something, where it started to recede. But we know people were here during that time, and that's around the time that the boreal forest was starting to, you know what I mean?
The boreal forest starts to appear very quickly.
Yeah.
And the septundra grows up. But that means that the Indigenous people and the buffalo and the forest all co-evolved in tandem.
Right. Isn't that fascinating? That people were part of that
absolutely
ecology.
They were absolutely part of it. And that means that both people and bison had to cope with the incoming or the growth of boreal forests.
Isn't that awesome?
And
I love that idea.
Yeah. And people are very empirical. People in communities watch. I mean, their whole life is based on having access to animals.
Yeah.
And they would see what happens. They would see that the boreal forest doesn't support large amounts of animals.
Sure.
And they would see that the buffalo on which they
relative to prairies, I guess we should say. We know that moose do well in the bush, but
moose don't eat spruce trees either. I mean, they'll nibble on them if they really have to, but that's not their preferential habitat. They prefer tender shoots and other kinds of plants. New growth.
Yep.
And so people would see that and they say, well, how can we make that happen? How can we prevent the boreal forest from keeping us from our livelihood?
Isn't that, I love that idea, because there's this thought today in society, like you see the rise of a lot of conservation groups that are not, I feel they're about making parks, right? And parks are great for certain reasons. But they're not the idea of keeping like we're going to put fences around this and we're going to keep this a forest, keep it natural. No people, get out of here, kind of thing. It's like, well, we've never had that. That's never been what this place is. And I understand that we have a different involvement now, the human beings. We've changed the way we interact with the world, so it's not the same. But I feel the interaction with the forest is one that I know now we're doing it completely differently, obviously, right? Like the original inhabitants, the indigenous people of this land had different ideas in mind than the current, capitalist culture does, obviously. But we're all people, we're all part of this, and we're all trying to have something that we can be proud of. And it can, like you said at the very beginning of your paper, was that the boreal forest is part of Canadian identity.
Yeah.
Right? It's this
We
mystique.
love the forest.
We love it.
We just love the forest.
Yeah.
And I look now at trees and I think we need to cut those down, and then we need to start to burn.
Yeah. Yeah, right. It is.
If you look, I gave a talk not
Sure.
long ago out at Elk Island Park,
Mm-hmm.
and Elk Island Park is a park that was fenced.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at early pictures of that park, it was all grassland.
Yeah.
And you go to that park now, and it's all overeaten forest.
Yeah. That's all. It's mostly aspen, and it's what
Which doesn't particularly benefit the bison, and they're just waiting. If we get a really bad dry season sometime and a fire start, they're very vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And I was talking with them and hoping I could encourage them to think about doing some serious fire management, not fire suppression, controlled burning.
I had, so right before the last podcast that I'm going to release, right before this one comes out, was with Greg Wilson. And and you know Greg, I'm assuming? He's with Elk Island now. He works there, and he's a bison ecologist and that kind of stuff. And we were talking about that. And I know that they're thinking about it. And they're trying to figure out how to do it in a way that is safe, effective, and not going to cause a huge problem.
I told them they should go in and hire a forestry company to go in and take out trees.
Yeah.
I looked at that forest quite differently. I hadn't been out there for a while, and I look at it and it's just thick, scrubby forest.
Yeah,
they should start cutting trees, and then they should start doing controlled burning in the cuts.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting.
I think that there's ways to do it safely and there's ways to do it dangerously.
Oh, and sustainably too, and not sustainably, right?
Yeah.
Like I agree. I think the forest industry has a huge role to play in this new era of, first of all, climate change and of big fires and of a habitat loss, and I think forestry has a huge role to play in all of this, and it's going to be different than before. Like. And I want to get back to us talking about Indigenous eventually, but we'll go off on a little tangent here for a minute. I think they have a huge role to play in this new paradigm of the forest, where we can't we need to get more burning back in the landscape. That much it seems to be clear.
But that is the Indigenous knowledge.
That is the Indigenous knowledge. And that's something that the Indigenous people need to be given the opportunity to do so, and not be, you know what I mean? And not be penalized for that.
Right.
But also I think in places where maybe we can't do burning because of its high risk and it's, and that kind of stuff, forest industry might be able to help out in that. Maybe we can harvest areas and then burn it, and then create, like, maybe we can do this in a very holistic way if we just all start to think about it. And we're going to have to create unique and new ways of managing the landscape, because we've never seen this before. This is new to everybody. Yeah. And so
and it's even new to many Indigenous people now, because of course controlled burning was stopped for such a long time.
That's my point, right?
That much of that knowledge has been lost. Some of it will still be there in some communities. It's interesting. Hank Lewis used to talk about how what the Indigenous people told him about burning matched what fire ecologists also had discovered about burning.
Of course.
They matched up very closely. That shouldn't be a big surprise.
Well, if you spend 13,000 years or 15,000 years
perfecting a land management skill,
you're probably going to know how to do it, because if you didn't, you wouldn't have survived that
exactly.
long, right?
And I think if forestry companies are partnering and developing close collaborative relationships with their neighboring Indigenous communities, they could sit down together and work out details for some pilot projects.
And I think that's going on. I think it's just sorting out the nitty gritty, and everyone's trying. There's a lot of politics involved, and there's a lot of argument. But I think in my heart of hearts, I believe that this is going to happen, and that there's people working towards this and trying to see eye to eye and trying to get to the table and speak the same language, figuratively speaking, as far as talking about the same thing, right? Talking about the same resources and having the same end result in mind, right? So I think it's happening. I think we're moving in that direction anyways. I don't think obviously there's a lot of disparity in Indigenous communities. They're not doing as well as everyone would hope they would be, and there needs to be a lot of work done to make sure that they can thrive, right? But I'm hopeful, at least I am hopeful that we can all come together and do this together, right?
Well, it's interesting. A major report on 1 year's fires from British Columbia talked about not about fireproofing the forest. They talked about fireproofing really only communities.
Yeah, because that's the high risk, right?
It's high risk, but it's also economically I mean, when you burn a whole community, it's a huge loss. The
Absolutely.
insurance companies have to pay out and people pay out. It's, and so they weren't really in Australia, they're talking about the million of wild animals that probably have perished in a miserable way in those fires. They didn't talk about that in BC. They mentioned the number of horses and cows, domestic animals that died.
It's true. And I don't know
so
what
I think the emphasis is forest in the north, in northern BC and northern Alberta is seen by government and industry primarily as an economic resource.
Yep. And that's changing, I think, but you're right. You're right. It's interesting that that we need to start stepping away from the idea of economic incentives being the only way to move forward, right? We need to start thinking about this as bigger than that, right? Include all values, right?
Well, you can include all values, but you can also protect the forest with strategic burning.
Of course you can.
And so, I mean, we've got huge labor forces, all those firefighters. It's a big labor force. Wood Buffalo Park has its own firefighting squads. Alberta has firefighters. We send them off to other places like California and Australia to help out. If you took areas that have been burned in these forest fires, say the recent fire up by Fort McMurray, and took some of those areas that have been burned, instead of just letting them grow up again, why not go in with bulldozers, knock down the windfall, and then starting to do very controlled strategic burns and gradually expand them using your firefighting crews who already know how to work with fire.
Yep. There's a lot of knowledge out there, and there's a lot of creative ideas that can work, I think. And obviously politics plays a role in that, and business incentive plays a role in that, as far as every industry, right? Whatever, any kind of extraction industry. And it's interesting, to say the least. But I think I foresee a bright future. I'm not saying it's going to happen quickly, but I foresee a future where I think as a society we're becoming more aware of what we actually need versus what the shortcomings of money gives us, right? Like, it's not, you know what I mean? It's not everything.
You're a little more optimistic than I am about the capitalist incentives.
Yeah.
But I think that's
another rabbit hole that we would get lost down.
But I think that forestry companies, given the amount of marketable timber they've lost in their forest management areas, if you were to say, we're going to sacrifice some of that timber. We've had these terrible forest fires, and it's going to take a long time before it builds up again anyway, enough so we can harvest it. If we take some of those areas that have been burned and we turn them into grasslands, or into parkland, it will enhance the value of those lands for the indigenous people and other people who want to use those lands. Yeah. And it will protect the timber we've got.
It's true. If only the forest companies had the ability to do that, right? Like they need.
But that's determined in large measure by the provincial forest management regulations.
Well, that's my point, right? Yeah. Is that we have laws in place to make sure that we don't have land conversion.
Right.
Right. We think that more forests the better. And I think trying to go back from that is going to take some time for people to recognize that, not just people, but
it's a different paradigm.
It's a completely
different paradigm.
Absolutely.
Fire suppression versus strategic controlled burning.
It's a different way of thinking about it, right? Like it makes it so much more complicated to think that, hey, we need to get away from the forest we have today and go back to something that we had. But then we have the problem of climate change. Right. And what's that going to, that's an entirely different.
Well, climate change is likely, if the predictions come true, climate change is likely to bring hotter weather, the sorts of winds and heat that lead to these fires.
Yep.
And again, how do you fireproof the forests that you've got?
Yeah.
You fireproof them by doing strategic burns.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And we do know, and of course we can't figure out for sure how indigenous people handled it, but there was that period after the end of the Pleistocene called the altithermal or the hypsothermal, when the climate warmed significantly. And I think it's very likely that people adapted to climate change at that time by their use of landscape management. And their only real landscape management tool in Alberta is controlled burning.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and I've had a number of podcasts on this already now, and it's interesting how difficult it is to get that into practice. Right? Like how many hoops you have to jump through and red tape you have to get through in order to make this work. Even if forest companies wanted to do it or wanted to help, or if the government wanted to do it, there's going to be there's outside interest groups, and the public's going to have their own ideas of what should happen, right? And so it's interesting to see.
The public has been educated to think that fire suppression is the ultimate goal.
It's true.
And if I had been living in Fort McMurray or Slave Lake when they burned down, I probably would have thought about trying to start a class action against the government for engineering those fires. Those fires were not just an accident. They were inevitable. In a bad year with high winds and dry conditions, and a fire begins.
Yeah, it's true. I think you're right in that it's, and then the question would come though was that they didn't, I don't think the government did that intentionally. Right? They had no idea.
But nevertheless, those fires were engineered by fire suppression policies and logging company programs.
Sure. It was an error of expansion, right?
They were not truly accidents.
No, you're right. No, absolutely right.
They were fires waiting to happen. It's the new normal.
It was engineered by people, whether intentional or not.
Yeah,
right?
I would never say they were intentionally engineered, but engineering is engineering.
Yeah, it happened.
It happened
because of what we've done.
That's right.
We're in this situation now, right? And it'll be interesting to see if we can try to turn back the clock, so to speak, a little bit. And you know what I mean? It's going to be interesting for sure the next little while.
And then the end of controlled burning. And one of the things that I worked with for the end of controlled burning in Wood Buffalo Park was some of the consequences. That park was set up originally to protect the wood bison, or the so-called wood bison. Right, genetically, there's no evidence to really name them as a separate species, and they didn't actually live in the woods. They're grassland animals in the north, just as they were in the south. But after suppression of fires and the forests start to grow up in what had been grasslands, we got some things that started to happen. One of which was that the bison population did not increase to the number that the government managers thought they should. And they blamed that primarily on the wolves. And because of that, then they started, there'd always been programs to protect the bison by killing wolves. And that was about their extent. We prevent native people from hunting bison and we'll kill wolves.
Right.
And then when they made this official decision that wolves are the problem, even though they didn't necessarily have much data for it, it was, to me, an example of bad science. And they
1920s were a weird time.
But this continued in the 30s and 40s.
Sure, okay.
And they set up poison programs, terrible programs to try to get rid of all the wolves, which were just seen as a kind of vermin in the park. Even though today the park is celebrated for its wolf bison ecosystem relationship.
Isn't it interesting that all of this mismanagement happened because of an intention to do good?
Yeah. No, right? The intentions were good, but so the bison didn't increase as much. The moose populations fell in part because if they can't hunt bison, people were hunting moose more heavily.
Sure.
They had also allowed a lot of white trappers into that park who also were killing moose. And in one year, the indigenous people in that park said they wanted to be able to start hunting bison again, which they should have been allowed to by the treaty, the promises made to them in 1899 through Treaty Number 8. And the government said, no, we will not let you hunt bison, and we're going to protect the moose by restricting you to hunt one male moose per family per year. And then 2 years later, they set up a formal bison slaughter program to supply cheap meat to the north. Still not letting native people hunt bison, but turning it into a resource for sale.
Isn't it a mess? How
it's an incredible, terrible thing that happened in that park.
And at that time, there would have been, like, I know when I had Greg on, he said around the 1920s, there was only 250 bison up in the north.
Well, we really don't know.
No, he said roughly. He said that roughly it was down to about 250. And that was the low point. And then and now we've got...
Well, they also then brought in all those bison from the Wainwright population, which brought in brucellosis and tuberculosis, as well as they were a different population. Sorry, I have to correct you on that, because I was talking to Greg, and I was asking him specifically about that, the brucellosis, tuberculosis thing. What he had told me is that what actually happened was, you're right in that around that time is when the TB and the brucellosis showed up there, but it wasn't actually in
the herd that came from Montana? So there was a herd in Montana that came to Elk Island, or not to Elk Island, but to
Wainwright.
Wainwright Park. And then those ones were moved and then a bunch of those were moved to Wood Buffalo.
Right.
To try and supplement. And when that happened at the same time, there was a bunch of programs, according to him, that were trying to create, what did he call it?
Catalo.
The Catalo, right?
Yeah, no,
and that's where it happened.
But what I'm saying, it's the buffalo that came from Wainwright that brought the disease. I'm not saying they brought the disease from Montana, but they certainly brought it from Wainwright.
Oh, see, I thought he said that it was, I might be misremembering it, but it came from that.
The experiments. And I thought the experiments were happening up north, but maybe they were happening in Wainwright. They were happening in Wainwright.
Oh, okay.
And they brought those bison up north,
Sure.
and where, of course, they immediately left the park, which led the government to expand the boundaries of the park.
Right.
And they also interbred with the local bison population that was already there.
Yeah.
And
it's a mess now. They're all, a lot of infected animals.
Yeah, a huge number of infected animals. We really don't know how much difference it makes in their lifespan. We do know that brucellosis will contribute to abortions among bison, and that could have been a factor leading to smaller bison numbers, but we really don't know for sure.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. The conversation I had with Greg was really interesting, talking about all of that stuff. What are the implications of TB and brucellosis? How did it get there? How do we fix this? What are our options, right? And
they tied that into the commercial slaughters. They said, well, we'll test the bison for TB, and if they test positive, then we'll kill them.
Yeah.
And hoping to reduce the amount of disease in the population.
Yeah.
And of course, by this time, the wolves were down to a very small number. So it might have been that there were more animals diseased because the wolves weren't taking them out.
Yeah.
It's complex history, and the data is somewhat uncertain.
Yeah.
I know that when they moved the bison from Wainwright to Wood Buffalo, they moved a lot of young animals. They didn't test them for TB. They sort of said, well, they're young. They probably aren't diseased.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of weirdness going on. Yeah.
It was stupidity in terms of government deciding to do this. And there were more factors involved than that.
Of course.
But that has led to this problem we have today, which is that there was a whole major impact assessment in which the government wanted to, the review panel ended up saying we should get rid of all those bison in Wood Buffalo Park and replace them with the genetically limited bison population at Elk Island that had been brought in from the park. Luckily, that didn't happen, but no one really knows what to do with the diseased bison in the park.
Yeah, that's what Greg said too. He said they're working on a vaccine. The hopes is to vaccinate the young towards these things, but and it's
two diseases, not just TB plus brucellosis. And TB is a tough disease. It's tough to get rid of in humans, tough to get rid of in animals.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a lot of what we talked about during that whole podcast. It was an hour and 30 minutes. And it was a lot about brucellosis and TB because it's a crazy problem for sure.
But then here's the next level of this. The Alberta and other governments are now establishing free-ranging populations of northern bison, wood bison.
Yep.
So we have the one in northwest Alberta, in the Denita area. And what the government has done to protect these bison, they don't want them coming in contact by any chance with bison in Wood Buffalo Park that are diseased, right? And so they basically set up a buffer zone all around the park. And they said any bison out in that area, we're going to define as non-wildlife.
That's livestock, right? Yeah.
And anybody can hunt them. There wouldn't be any monitoring, any controls. And I heard actually horrific stories from Native elders in the Fort McKay area who talked about government employees, contractors going up there, hiring helicopters to do aerial hunting. I've not seen this myself. That's a tradition that's going on right now. Eventually, they did tests for genetics and disease in these bison south of the park and the ones in the Mi'kmaq Wabasca area. And they discovered, lo and behold, that they weren't diseased. They didn't show any disease. And genetically, they were different from the bison in the park, which suggests to me that they probably have been remnant populations of the northern bison for a long time.
Yeah.
And the bison, eventually the government said, okay, we're going to protect the Ronald Lake bison, the one south of the park, and north of the bison that are in the area that wants to be mined by tech. So it's a big current controversy right now.
Yeah. Yeah. That was also something we discussed, was that whole there being, and I asked him, like you said, that was done intentionally to try and keep brucellosis and TB from spreading.
Yes,
right? And
but they hadn't realized. No one had bothered. They just assumed if there were any bison out of the park, they were escapees.
Right.
Again, another example of bad science.
Good point. Yeah.
They assumed.
Yep.
And when they finally tested, they found it wasn't true. But the problem now with tech is that they said, well, we can't look after all the bison because it's not on our lands. And it's going to require a lot of cooperation from both the provincial government and the federal government. There's a worry that those bison will be driven into the park where they will contract disease from the bison, the park bison. And nobody has thought about controlled burning as a potential mitigating remedy. If I were tech, I would be looking at doing some pilot projects with controlled burning to the south to try to encourage the bison not to move north. And Wood Buffalo Park could be doing some controlled burning to encourage its bison to stay to the north.
Yeah.
Would that work? I don't know. But the ultimate mitigation proposed by contractors who did a report for tech was that if they come in contact with each other, we'll just depopulate them.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. Like it's
more than unfortunate because these Ronald Lake bison, there has been some study on them lately, but they very well may be the last truly northern bison internationally that are disease free and retain their original genetic structure.
Yeah.
Internationally, of all the bison in the world.
Yeah.
It may come down to the Ronald Lake bison.
Yeah, I know Greg said they're doing a lot of work on paying attention to them, right? And they do know all that, as you said, right? They don't. I didn't know about the specifics around the Ronald Lake herd being susceptible to the livestock thing. I thought they were considered part of the bison management area, but maybe I was I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. But
no, the government hasn't moved to protect the Wabasca-Miqua herd, and I don't know why that is. Because as far as I know, they have also tested disease-free and genetically different. But these are remarkable populations of bison that both of them need work and need at very least interim protection. Yeah,
of course. Yeah, for sure. So so in your paper, you tied the idea of in a lot of these what would you call them, the tellings of the surveyors and settlers and researchers and that kind of stuff of the turn of the 20th century. You had said that the word that saying that bison was synonymous with the idea of plains in that area, right?
Well,
explain that a little bit.
In my thinking, okay, certainly we think of bison in the Great Plains as the same, although bison actually extended almost everywhere in the continent. Bison extended from north of Great Slave Lake all the way to northern Mexico, from California all the way to Florida and Pennsylvania. It was an incredibly broad and diverse population.
Yeah, no kidding.
They thrived, in other words, after
tens of millions of them.
After the megafauna, the Pleistocene extinctions of the other megafauna, the bison thrived. And those bison really only diminished when Europeans arrived. In northern Alberta, they diminished. They were pretty much gone in most of those areas by 1840. And of course, we know in the plains, they were gone a few decades after that. Yeah. But in the north, I think of anywhere that you find bison, that you're probably going to find grasslands. Right. So we know we have these huge grasslands north of the Peace River. We have them along the Caribou Mountains. We have them, of course, in the whole Peace River country. There are really interesting pictographs in northern Saskatchewan on the Churchill River area that were done by ancestors of Cree people and some of these pictographs show bison. Yeah. I figure if you have a bison pictograph, it probably means there were bison in the area. Yeah, for sure. There are place names such as Buffalo Narrows and Buffalo Lake, which now is Peter Pond Lake, unfortunately, because it hides the fact that was originally named for buffalo. There were probably buffalo there. We think there were, and people talk about patches of grassland. So they may not have been burning the extensive grassland we see in the Peace River country, but they're certainly burning. Sure, for sure. That's the only way those patches are going to appear. The whole area along the Clearwater River was a huge swath of beautiful open prairie.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's an interesting issue to try to circumvent, right?
Well, those bison probably extended, at least according to the pictograph evidence, they probably extend all the way to Montana, to northern Manitoba.
Oh, okay.
In some areas. So one of the things that I want to do eventually is to make a map of the northern bison territory.
Right.
There is no southern boundary.
Yeah, right. It just goes, yeah.
It just goes and it would have merged in with other bison populations to the south.
There was a story that I heard that when Cortez came across and ran into Montezuma down in wherever that was, in South America somewhere, right? He actually, Cortez came across, Montezuma had actually a bison in its, like, in a cage or something like that. And they had assumed that it had been brought down from somewhere else. Later on, once, like at the time, he'd never seen it.
That would have been Central Mexico.
Central Mexico. Sorry, that's what it was. Yes,
and in the Aztec area, and it would have been brought down from northern Mexico.
From northern Mexico. So, but even back, So but I guess it's an interesting story where he comes across this massive beast, and he's like, "I've never seen such a thing." Right? Like So even down in Mexico, they extended. Yeah, it's amazing that there's such a prominent species that we managed to successfly wipe out in a matter of a few decades.
Well,
right?
they evolve in Europe. Of course, we have cave paintings of the bison from the caves. They go back a huge area. When you think of them as a circumpolar species that then expands into almost all the rest of North America.
Yeah, they're cool species.
It's amazing.
It is awesome. So, getting back to burning a little bit.
But burning happened all over North America.
Yeah, right.
So burning would have not just been done by the people I've been talking about in northern Alberta. It was certainly done in California. It was done throughout the Great Plains, and in particular the eastern part of the Great Plains where you get the tall grass.
Right.
It was done all through the southeast and the northeast.
Yeah.
These are also areas with buffalo and, of course, other plants and animals that indigenous people relied upon.
Absolutely.
And there has been material published on Indian burning in many, many parts now of North America.
For sure. So how do you propose, like, in your mind, how do you think we go about, like, we're in a new era now, right? This is a new situation where we have millions and millions and millions of more people in North America than existed back then. We have private land, we got public land, we've got cities and highways and roads and parks and everything. So we've got a vastly different landscape in every sense of the word than we did back then. So in my mind, to go back to what we had back then seems unreasonable. But
in some areas, some areas, I think it's feasible. I think you could do it in Elk Island Park.
For sure.
You could restore the grasslands that existed when the park was created. Okay. I think you could certainly make an effort at going back and restoring some of the landscape that existed in Wood Buffalo.
Sure.
When it was created as a park. There are people who want to rewild the bison.
Right.
In many parts you see it in the United States. Now, one of the unfortunate things about buffalo in the United States is they almost all have cattle genetic material. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Because there have been all of these experiments by people who didn't think the buffalo were good enough. They want to improve cattle species. Yeah. The catalo, the buffalo,
catalo.
Yeah.
Sounds like something out of a Margaret Atwood book.
Yeah. Well, it could be. So that's a problem, but there are a number of, buffalo have been brought into, Yellowstone.
Yep.
The problem is with the neighbors in Yellowstone.
Supposedly they never totally go away in Yellowstone?
I can't remember. They certainly had to reintroduce wolves. I
think there was a remnant population that survived in Yellowstone.
Now they've brought back bison they've just announced that bison have been brought back to a Big Stone. Cree area in northern Alberta. Ideally, if they want those bison to be really successful, they should do some controlled burning to open up the grasslands for them.
Banff as well, right?
Banff
just had that release in 2018.
There are a lot of First Nations in particular that are very keen to have bison on their reserves. So it's a matter of what happens at the boundaries.
Yeah, totally. So how do you think we go about doing that? Like, I think we're talking with Greg Wilson last podcast about exactly this problem, right? How do we get more, because his dream is to have more contiguous or more wild herds in the northern boreal that are just there and they're doing well, and they, you know what I mean? In your mind, I would imagine that means we have to start doing more burning. We have to have more grasslands. We have to have more of the prairie that we had before,
right.
or parkland that we had
that
before.
Will support the bison.
So how do we go about, how would you suggest we go about doing something as complicated and radical? Like, you know what I mean? Like, as far as the government and industry is concerned, that's a radical idea, and they'll just roll their eyes and go look at these dreamers or whatever, right? So I wonder, how do we start to convince people, like, hey, if we want this wilderness back, and we want to support Indigenous people and Indigenous values, and we want to try to have a balanced ecology, we would start to pay attention to these type of things, right? Well,
there is the effort to establish the wood bison population in northwest Alberta, which has done very well. Mm-hmm. In fact, so well that it expanded past the protected area, and the government actually set up some hunts. So you could go and kill those bison.
Yep.
And they did that because they didn't want them coming close to Wood Buffalo Park, where they could then come in contact with diseased animals. Right. So it's an ongoing issue.
The Fort Vermilion herd there, I think, right? What do they call that herd?
Oh, the herd just east of Fort Vermilion. Yeah, there's a diseased herd there.
Oh, okay. Right.
The ones down at Mi'kmaq are supposed to be okay. It's supposed to be disease free.
Yeah.
So the fact that the Wainwright bison brought disease into northern Alberta is an enduring legacy that we don't know how to deal with.
Yeah.
In fact, whether or not it would have even been possible to wipe them all out is doubtful in a place as big as Wood Buffalo Park.
It doesn't sound like I know that was some of the original idea.
That was a very
let's get rid of them and start fresh, right?
Yeah.
But obviously the genetic uniqueness of the remnant bison that were there, they wanted to maintain that genetics.
Well, those bison in Wood Buffalo Park, along with these with the Ronald Lake bison and the Wabasca Mi'kmaq bison, probably have the most diverse of all of the genetics of all of the pre-European bison that were in North America.
Yeah, it's cool. Which is very cool. Very lucky to have
there has been very little effort to, salvage the genetics. So
probably a funding thing, I would imagine. I don't imagine it's a hearts and minds problem, but
the Ronald Lake bison, and in fact, when I was at Elk Island, I asked them if they were thinking about removing some individuals from that Ronald Lake population and setting them up as a separate population at Elk Island, which would be there are people who are looking at in vitro fertilization and all sorts of other complicated ways to harvest genetics.
There's a lot of work being done on bison, for sure.
There is.
A lot of smart people doing a lot of smart things.
But I don't see much on the ground.
Sure.
And I think that, at some point, someone will figure out how to deal with wood buffalo. And I agree that bison that have not come in contact with them, you don't want that happening.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things that Wood Buffalo Park could do is start to allow its indigenous residents to hunt buffalo again. It's a treaty right. And we have bison that are genetically, there are certainly people who prefer eating bison that aren't diseased, but why not let them start hunting bison again?
Yeah, it's interesting.
In the park. There are lots of bison. You want to reduce the number of bison, let people hunt.
Yeah, if you want to reduce it, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's if they want to do that, or if they...
It's like a paradigm. It's like the fire suppression paradigm versus controlled burning. It's protect the bison forever versus allow... The treaty basically said, Treaty 8 said, we may want to impose regulations on hunting for some things, and we do it only we do it to protect the bison, the animals that you rely upon. And once they don't need that protection anymore, you'd be able to go back and hunt them.
Yeah.
That was a promise made by the commissioners, and they could honor that promise in Wood Buffalo Park and allow them to start hunting bison.
Yeah, it's a tough one. It's such a...
And they could do it as a controlled thing. They could track the disease. They could do the genetic sampling. My guess is that Wood Buffalo Park probably doesn't have the money to do that kind of testing.
I think they're pretty underfunded.
The parks has other priorities for its funding.
For sure.
But that would be something that I think they could do. I mean, gradually reduce the number of bison in the park that are diseased, with the idea to making it perhaps a more manageable solution. Use controlled burning to keep the bison away from the boundaries.
Yeah. It's an interesting issue.
Think of controlled burning as something, if you create high quality habitat that bison will like, they'll go there.
For sure. Yeah. I would love to see more controlled burning happen on the landscape more. And that's what it is. Like Indigenous burning is they know what they're doing. They know what's going to burn and what's not going to burn. It's not going to be out of control. It's not going to be this big wildfire.
You have to be careful.
Of course you do, but they know.
But if you do enough burning, then when you do get a forest fire, it doesn't go anywhere.
Right.
You get there's good statements from the park who says, well, there was a horrendous fire that started on the edge of the Slave River, but when it came to the grassland, it stopped.
Or at least they've just burnt through some grass and the grass comes back the next year. So it's fine.
Yeah. So it wasn't a problem. Even the evidence from the European or Canadian observers showed that those fires weren't a problem.
Yeah.
In the early days of the park.
And now we're in this.
And now the park burns regularly. The whole park.
They do. Oh,
I mean, they burn wildfires. There are wildfires in that park.
Absolutely. Well, the Richardson fire, I know, got into there a little bit, and there was some. Yeah, there's lots of fires, and it's
they have the maps showing the fires that have burned. Those fires started burning around 1944, and they've burned regularly different parts of the park ever since.
Yeah, you had explained at the end of your talk you were talking about how when these large fires started happening and how that related to the loss of cultural or of Indigenous burning, right? Do you want to go through that quickly, just how that relationship works?
Well, it's pretty straightforward. If you have a
drought in there,
if you have a landscape that is managed by Indigenous burning, and then that burning is stopped, the landscape will begin to grow up with shrubs and trees. And after 25 to 30 years, you have a lot of ground litter. You have lots of things to burn. Yeah. And so I think the burning probably was stopped for the most part in that park in the early 20s.
Right.
And what happened in the park in the early 20s was that the government set up a very complex warden system and had the wardens actually living in cabins out on the land so that they could surveil the Indigenous people.
Sure.
And so if you're afraid of being caught doing something illegal, then you stop doing it.
Yeah.
And so the land builds up this ground litter. It builds up lots of flammable stuff. And then you get into the 40s where you have 25 years or so of growth. And then you get a dry year. You start to get some drought.
You said there was a big drought in the 39,
there was a lot of drought. It went into the 40s and into the 50s. And so you get fires. Yeah. It could just be a simple lightning fire.
Yeah. The hazard went up.
The hazard is huge, and all you need is a dry year.
Yeah.
And you're going to have a major Holocaust fire.
Yeah. And that's continued throughout. One thing that I thought was interesting was I got the impression that, and I want to be clear, is that a lot of the burning being done by Indigenous folk was in, excuse me, a lot of the burning being done by Indigenous people was done in the parkland, right? So was that being done in the boreal as well, like in the central mixedwood and stuff? Because obviously we know that there were tribes that lived in the thick bush, right? That
like where? Where are you thinking?
My understanding, I don't know specifically. You know way more about it than I do. That's what I'm asking. I thought that there was groups that were living in the middle of the boreal.
They'll be burning.
They'll be burning. They will be burning in the boreal too. That's my question. It's not just the parkland.
But we call this the boreal forest.
Sure.
Right? But that's a bit of a misnomer because there is forest. If you look at the descriptions from a lot of these areas, you have the grasslands. You do have trees.
Sure.
But the trees tend to be along the rivers.
Right.
And they're also in the muskeg areas, and you get wetlands. And so you do get trees, but there's lovely descriptions talking about how the trees are big. There are not a lot of them, but they're very big, which suggests to me that they have been preserved.
They're in the riparian area, right? They're in lots of richness, lots of, And
so I can't imagine given that is what makes for a successful way of life, how people would live in that area and not do that kind of burning.
Mm-hmm. I guess my question is more, sorry.
I'm thinking even say Lesser Slave Lake, there would have been burning. We just don't know much about it.
That's my point. I'm saying,
okay.
Is there, because the whole idea that we were talking about is that the with fire suppression and the lack of indigenous burning going on, the fire hazard went up.
Right.
But if
you're suggesting there might be areas where there hadn't been the burning.
Sure. I'm wondering if that's true or if it was kind of all over. It was everywhere, right?
I think it must have been all over.
Okay.
Now, it doesn't mean that they necessarily burned huge areas everywhere.
No.
We see in northern Saskatchewan references to burning to patches of grassland.
Sure.
I know that when route goes up, there's a historic trail that goes up from the Peace River up along the east side of the Caribou Mountains. Mm-hmm. And he talks about grasslands in there.
Right.
Not huge areas, but there are grasslands. And if you get grasslands, they have to be maintained by regular occasional burning or they'll grow up into shrubs and trees. And
in your mind, what is the problem now with, because people might be thinking about this. Okay, well now we have all these massive Holocaust fires that, like you said, and we know that's true. The fires are getting bigger and there's more of them, right? And they're burning more and more land. Isn't that an opportunity to try to take those burnt areas?
Oh yeah,
and maybe try to. I don't want to say the word convert because that sounds like
that's. I think that would be an. I mean, yeah. If you start to try to burn now in a boreal forest, it's dangerous. Mm-hmm. Very difficult to do. Mm-hmm. You've got these big trees, lots of ground litter. Mm-hmm. It's just plain hazardous to try to burn there. But if you've got an area that's already been burned, then why not start there? Yeah. Start small. Like I said, if you have an area that's full of windfall, then you get someone in with a bulldozer and you bulldoze that stuff down. Then you do spring burnings.
It's interesting.
And you burn over and over for several years until you return it to grassland. And then once it's returned to true grassland, you probably don't have to burn it every year.
Right.
You could probably burn it every 2 to 3 years.
Because there's less of a seed bed. There's less. Yeah, it's just not there. The roots aren't there anymore. And so
I would start with areas that have gone through forest fires.
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
It makes sense to me.
Yeah, it's kind of anecdotal, but it makes sense.
But what we need some people to start projects, some pilot projects with this.
Yeah.
So that's how you get the evidence to show, can we do this? And if we want to do it, how do we do it?
And it's a fire reduction strategy as well. Because you're creating these areas that if another big, large Holocaust fire, as you said, comes through, it'll be slowed down by this grassland.
That's right. It's a mitigation strategy.
Or at least it gives, mitigation strategy for sure. So there's potential there to reduce fire hazard in the boreal, increase biodiversity.
Increase biodiversity, increase the vegetables, the plants and animals that everyone relies upon if you live in those areas.
People, yeah.
It's not just indigenous people, it's all the other non-indigenous people who also live in the north and want to hunt.
Yep.
I think that we really need some people to step up and start doing these pilot projects.
Yeah.
And it would be wonderful to see the forest companies leading the way in this.
Mm-hmm. I think they don't have the knowledge to do that kind of stuff. Like they understand the forest, they understand the ecology, but I think as far as the understanding cultural burning and understanding the conversion of, I don't think. But yeah, they could be collaboration.
They could collaborate with.
Absolutely.
You get those forest companies up in, say, northwest Alberta. They could collaborate with the Denitaw, who were still doing this when in the 70s, when Hank Lewis was doing his ethnographic field work with them. Sure. They could hire a good fire ecologist to work with them in that and come up with a plan.
It would need to be a 3-way thing. Like the government would need to be involved.
A tripart.
Right?
Well, I was thinking, the government should be involved.
They'll have to be because it's public land.
Well, that's true. And start a project and see what happens.
Right.
I mean, I'm all for some empirical experimentation.
I think forest companies would be very interested in collaborating in that kind of stuff because they're always collaborating, and whether it's wetlands conservation or species at risk or caribou or whatever, right? They're always trying to collaborate and improve the landscape for every value, not just timber value. So
now,
I think you're right.
At our workshop, there was a woman who spoke at a workshop who has a company that is doing some controlled burning in BC. And yes. She was doing some very exciting work. I'm hoping actually to have the chance to go and visit her sometime when they're doing a controlled burn.
Yeah.
Because she is working with First Nations.
Yes. Yeah. We were talking about that at the conference there. Yeah. I'm excited about that. There were some whispers about maybe some places in Alberta that might be getting some prescribed burn, which would be awesome. Yeah.
Well, I think if she's already doing it in Northeast BC, why not start something in Northwest Alberta?
Absolutely.
See what happens.
I think there's more and more of a desire to have this happen. I think it's becoming more of a regular conversation. More people are aware of it. And I believe that we're going to start seeing more of this. I think it's going to become more regular, and the science is going to start to support it. And with it, public opinion and industry will follow, or government will follow, or whatever, right? I think so, personally.
Well, no one wants to live in a town that burns down.
Of course not.
It's our bottom. Some of your listeners might be very interested in the film that Professor Lewis did called Fires of Spring. The whole film is not available, although some of us have copies. Yeah. But I think that a portion of it may be available on YouTube. Okay. Fires of Spring.
It's
very convincing.
Yeah. Cool. No, I love hearing controversial ideas around how our landscape works and how it used to be, the history of it, to know where we need to go, right? Especially in an era of climate change and the situation we have now. It's really fun to look back and see what happened, what it was and what it is now, and how maybe we can start to get back to that. And maybe with that, we'll see, like you said, an increase in bison population, right? Which with that will increase the productivity of the landscape just from the pure amount of bison crap on the landscape, right. And everything else, right? Like there's
and the other animals that come with that kind of landscape.
Yeah.
You probably would have more moose. You'd probably protect some of those areas of lichen that caribou winter on. It could feed into the caribou protection plan.
There's so many.
There's possibilities are huge.
It'd be. I love talking about this stuff and just kind of getting the ideas out there, getting people thinking about it, right? So. Yeah, it's awesome. When's your how far along are you in this book that talks about all this stuff?
Well, I'm working on a book now about the northern bison, an ethnohistory of the northern bison, and that has a lot to do with fire.
Right.
Obviously.
Of course, yeah.
So I have to do another major edit.
Okay.
And in the meantime, there's been more work come out, so I have to do some more reading, of course.
Okay. So when do you expect that book to come out?
Well, I hope sometime maybe towards the end of this year. We'll see.
Okay. And what's that going to be called?
Probably the ethnohistory of northern bison.
The ethnohistory board. Keep it simple. Just straightforward.
Just keep it simple. That's right.
Awesome. Well, this is
not a simple story, but a great simple topic.
Yeah, it's nice when the title explains everything. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, I appreciate you coming on. This is a great conversation. We got to a lot of stuff and got through a lot of interesting stuff that people may not have thought of in the past. So. This is awesome.
Well,
I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, this is great. Thanks a lot for listening, guys. I hope you enjoyed that. I really enjoyed it. It was great to talk to her. It definitely got me thinking differently. So I hope you guys liked it too. Make sure to rate and review, share it with a friend, tell a friend about it. Word of mouth is the best thing you guys can do for me if you want to support the podcast. So I really appreciate it. Thanks a lot, guys. And we'll catch you next time.